Hi, my name is Vanessa Mason, and welcome to my session for South by Southwest Online 2021. Today, I'm going to be covering a few of the wonderful, great startup opportunities related to belonging, which is a basic human need, and really highlighting the ways in which we are redefining and looking at new approaches to belonging that might be very informative for startups moving forward. So just as a little bit of context for this presentation, one of my intentions for 2020 was to learn in public. And I launched this newsletter, Future of Belonging, basically to provide space and an opportunity to share my thoughts and learnings that I was getting from writing about this topic weekly. This topic is one that I've been curious about for years. I work as a futurist in my day job, but also just in my personal life. It's always been sort of this question of where are the spaces for belonging and which ways can belonging sort of show up in life. And so I started this project in Learning in Public in part to move past my fear of not knowing things, and also a desire, again, to connect with people and find new spaces of belonging. So why should you be looking at belonging? So there's a few different reasons why belonging is important and why it's something of interest. One are these three major forces that you see outlined here. So first is something that you probably have heard about. There's been probably a fair amount of media coverage talking about the loneliness epidemic. The two surgeon generals ago actually wrote a book all about the loneliness epidemic. And basically what this means is that a lot more people report not having any friends. And I think maybe one of the dimensions of this that's missed a little bit more is that it's not just about not having friends, but even for the relationships that they have in their lives, whether they're with family, romantic relationships, or friendships, that they don't have quality relationships. They don't have people that they feel that they really truly connect with, who really see them. So that's one major force we're looking at why belonging might be changing in the way we think about it in the future if we have all of these people who feel lonely. The second force is disaffiliation. So historically, Americans have belonged to a lot of different institutions and placed trust in a lot of different institutions. A lot of this is looking at religion and how religious membership has gone down. But it's not just, of course, religion. It used to belong to a lot of social clubs. If you think about sort of historic places like, the Elks, the Rotary Club, the Key Club, and just generally, if you probably think about your own life, there are probably very few spaces where you can go and sort of, you see people on an ongoing basis, especially once you get out of school. So just generally, in terms of institutional connections to finding other people, there's a lot less of that happening in the United States and certainly in other places in the world as well. And then this last piece around displacement. This could be economic displacement, so gentrification of neighborhoods, sort of changing how communities relate to each other and who belongs in those particular physical places. This also is displacement due to things like climate change, like for people who've been displaced due to extreme weather events or, in other global areas where they aren't able to grow food or able to be stably housed. Just the sort of notion that mobility is just a lot more common, and particularly sort of forced mobility and forced migration and having to change location is really undermining sort of people's and communities' sense of being rooted and connected and stable. So with all of these three forces, you can kind of see how if you're looking for spaces to belong in or having this feeling that you belong and that sort of stability and comfort, that there probably aren't very many spaces for that going forward. And so in looking at this, I wanted to not sort of think that everything was going to be terrible looking at the future, but really where are there ways in which people are pioneering new approaches to this? So before we get too far, I want to introduce a working definition of belonging to shape our discussion today. So first is this sort of initial layer of safety and comfort. So this is both physical safety as well as psychological safety, and ways in which that allow people to fully participate in whatever relationship or sort of space or networks or communities that they are a part of. This is essential and fundamental to belonging, the feeling that, that you are okay, that meaning that the identity of you is okay, and also that the sort of wherever you are, that you feel that you are okay. way. Secondly is this emotional connection. So this really gets to, again, that sort of relationship and connection piece. Do you feel sort of affection and warmth from people who are around you, or for the sort of connections that you might have? Are they providing that sort of sense of external validation and witnessing? You know, do they see you for who you are? Do they see your actions for what they are? And do you kind of feel like you at least matter in the eyes of at least one other person? And so that's the sort of emotional connection piece. The third is something that I think that we don't really talk about much as a society. It shows up in places, of course, like religion, but it's not the only location where we might find belongings in religion, of course. But as humans, we have this need to have spaces where we can kind of make sense of things, where we can uncover meaning and find ways of pursuing meaning. And so belonging at the sort of like third aspect is really about how can we find meaning among, especially now if we think about today's world, all of the sort of chaos, uncertainty, all of the volatility that's involved. And so all three of these arenas are vital to sort of this overarching sort of definition of belonging that I'm going to be working with today. And so I just want you to keep those in mind. So to pivot to, of course, the topic of our conversation today, how can startups build belonging? Well, I want to introduce a few key principles that relate to sort of thinking about technology, because of course, a lot of us equate technology and startups together, but a lot of the examples I'm going to show you today aren't necessarily technologically driven, but there are three key principles to keep in mind. One is that belonging happens by design and not by accident. This isn't going to be something where you sort of like, if you build it, they will come, or people sort of find emotional connection simply because there are people there. And as we look over, especially the next decade, we're moving from a lot of belonging sort of happening by kind of like proximity and by constraint, and really to just having an overabundance of choice and sort of choosing the people, places, and ways in which we belong. And so one thing to just keep in mind is because it's happening by design, like there's obviously a lot of opportunity there, but with the sort of freedom of choice comes a burden too, that you have a lot more choices to make. Secondly, sort of related to this is that because we aren't really locked into place, we aren't locked into relationships and sort of social expectations, that belonging itself is a lot less fixed and far more mutable than it ever has been before. This includes sort of mutability in terms of maybe the kind of like options you have available in terms of maybe your chosen social identity or the relationships that you choose to have. It also means that it's mutability in terms of space and time as well. If you're moving locations, if you're changing as a person, if sort of external circumstances no longer sort of make sense and you sort of need to move out of maybe a post-truth context, that basically belonging no longer is a one and done prospect. The third key principle is that tech that builds belonging is relational and not transactional. And so ultimately, startups that are really looking to be in this space and address this human need, and hopefully everyone is really trying to address fundamental human needs, that really it's all about prioritizing connection. It's less about sort of how efficient things are, how productive things are, and really about how can you sort of build, foster, support, sustain relationships, yes, like at scale, but certainly both in terms of quality as well as quantity. So out of the work that I've been doing over the last year, I've created this framework to really understand some of the kind of opportunity spaces, that might be a good way of putting it, in which startups could be thinking about addressing belonging. And so I'm going to walk through all of these right now and give examples of where I've seen either companies or sort of initiatives that have really found kind of creative ways to foster this in ways that might be inspirational. So starting with identity. Identity is all about the ways in which we are defining, creating, sometimes even concealing or revealing, and choosing to reveal who we are to those folks, to anyone around us. And so a lot of the key technologies that, of course, that I think that are affecting this are things like brain computing interfaces, like the potential to be able to share our thoughts and emotions with people or to have those be visible. All of the kind of like digital identity management that kind of happens. A lot of that can be seen through synthetic media. So the ability to be able to either clone yourself or to be able to create a facsimile of maybe a self that might be more acceptable in certain spaces, to be able to impart certain information. And I think this sort of last space, the sort of quote unquote vices. So a lot of the kind of like psychedelics and cannabis tech, which are really allowing kind of access to alternate planes of consciousness. There's a lot of an MIT research that's looking at how we can maybe manipulate dreams. And so all of these ways in which we can kind of like access our minds in different ways that we haven't been able to before, and even manipulate our minds, all play into how we define who we are and how we can choose to display that. So one example of this, of course, going with the synthetic media kind of example, is that this is a company called Resemble that allows you to clone your voice. So you can clone your voice for things like gaming. You can do things like film narration, Alexa skills, podcasts. It's just a wide range of things, certainly in a commercial context that you could see using this for. But maybe this is something that you could see eventually being used for people not showing up to work meetings and therefore kind of occupying multiple jobs. Kids in remote school kind of using this to kind of somewhat show up for class, but not really. You can certainly see maybe some like playful uses of technologies like this, being able to mimic and create voices and clone voices. But it also could be a way for a lot of sort of bad actors and being able to impersonate someone else, maybe making whether it's a public official or someone else, seem like they said something when they in fact haven't said that at all. And so this is just a super interesting space when thinking about our identities, especially apart from our physical identities, and looking at digital identity and how that can even have real world action. Next up is place. So of course we think of place as physical locations, but the place isn't simply restricted to this, as we can see from this very scary McDonald's meme. It also could be all of our kind of virtual spaces, temporal spaces, like, a concert is a temporal space. It's something that coming together to be able to listen to a particular musical act at a single point in time with a group of people, most of whom you probably aren't going to know. And so place is all about all of the geographical, the social, virtual, temporal spaces, the boundaries that define those spaces, and that kind of dynamic between like who you are in a particular place, who's around you, and what are your sense of sort of safety, comfort, and emotional connection to that particular place. So a lot of the key technologies, of course, like Clubhouse has been a breakout company in the audio spaces. We've seen a lot of kind of macro gatherings, especially with the pandemic, like things like Fortnite concerts. But it's not just things like that. I think there's been a lot more movement around what does digital public space look like. So much like in our real world, we have public spaces like parks and libraries. And so there's a lot of both like research and sort of attempts to think about what does public space look like digitally, in particular that isn't necessarily owned by one of the 5 large tech companies. And then of course, like things like space, XR, metaverse, gaming, like all these sort of other sort of virtual spaces that exist. And then this last piece, space exploration, which I think is just going to introduce a lot of ethical questions about who has access to space, who chooses to do what to be there, just because we're kind of starting from square one in terms of looking at new physical space when thinking about space exploration. And thus far, it looks very privatized, so it'll be an interesting space going forward. And so an easy example of this is a company called TeamIco, which is a Stockholm-based startup that really is sort of not looking at the sort of remote work question as, should workers be in physical space or should they be in virtual space, but rather is just trying to kind of whole cloth reimagine what does virtual space look like. And so TeamIco literally calls themselves a virtual office in much the same way in a physical office. In their virtual spaces, you kind of wander in between rooms. You're able to have kind of casual conversations with folks, casual kind of collaborations. There's a sort of like physical change of location, that sense of like kind of serendipity, and also just the sort of ease of kind of office relationships that I think that a lot of us realize that we're missing now that we aren't in physical offices. And so I think startups like this, especially those I think that are really organized around, we've seen a lot around like digital safety. What does it mean to craft a digitally safe space? And certainly in our physical world, with a lot of both, even before COVID, there were a lot of physical locations that were being abandoned, whether you're looking at kind of suburban malls, and then suddenly, now we're all looking at the sort of like abandoned office space. There's a lot of questions around how that space can be repurposed or reused or sort of reimagined in ways that is more conducive to the human needs that are there for people to feel connected to community. And third, in our inner circle of our sort of direct connections to belonging are relationships. So these are inclusive of all relationships. So kinship, those family relationships, are friendships, romantic, and also romantic relationships as well. There's a lot of sex tech work going on, which is very, very exciting. I think that's sort of an arena that doesn't get explored as much, and especially a lot of women founders doing a lot of very interesting ways of thinking of exploring women's sexuality. Certainly emotion AI, if you haven't heard of this is basically the ability to use AI to either infer or predict emotional states, and by extension, of course, being able to induce emotional states by being able to predict and detect those. Definitely highly controversial of whether or not this technology works. What is it actually detecting? What does it actually mean to manipulate emotions, especially because a lot of this work is being done for things like advertising. And then potentially, depending on which arena of the world you're looking at, certainly kind of state surveillance. Definitely a weird sort of area to watch and a very interesting one from the technology front. And these last two for me are most interesting, less so for the kind of commercial applications of these, but more from thinking about disability tech. So a lot of assistive technologies use things like haptics, kind of effective computing and robotics for folks who are living with disabilities and maybe are disconnected from our world that is still very constructed in ways that are very ableist. And so I think some of the most interesting ways in which we're going to understand kind of human relationships and sort of human connection are really going to come out of like, how can we have folks with disabilities be part of the world in ways in which they have not been able to be previously. One of the most exciting examples I've seen with this is a startup out of Y Combinator called Artifact that came out of, I believe, the spring 2020 class. And as you can see from the quote below, Artifact is this American life for all of us. It's ostensibly like a way of creating podcasts. And so what I think distinguishes Artifact from sort of, being able to just like record audio on your own anywhere is one, that they're really positioning their product as this instant heirloom, and that they see themselves as unlocking connection basically with people closest to you in your life, because what they're doing are pairing professional interviewers. So these might be folks who come from public radio or otherwise are doing sort of professional interviews, and pairing those with other people to be able to capture personal stories. You can see from the slide, there's a few examples that I captured from their website. So these might be things like, newlyweds, capturing a milestone in a particular business when they kind of hit a very rough patch and what it took to get out of it. Maybe major family events, so capturing family histories for folks. And it's just this idea that it's very intimate, and it also, because it becomes a sort of digital and especially audio recording of this, is that that it does take on that heirloom quality, that it does feel like that it comes from this particular person, that it's all about sort of their relationships, their care, their values, and that becomes kind of this thing that can be taken forward for years and years and years in perpetuity. And so I think it's just a really intriguing way of thinking about how, in particular, with thinking about relationships, especially as they become more mutable in the future, people from like moving around a lot more, maybe not having as many family connections, whether it's friends connections, like having this ability to mark history in something as intimate as audio, and also something that can be permanent, becomes very powerful for building quality relationships over time. So next up we have networks. So if you kind of remember the framework that I showed before, it's sort of this kind of three concentric circles. And so we've kind of covered this inner circle of like all of our direct connections for belonging. So the direct connections to people, so both to self and to others who are immediately around us. These next two, both our networks and communities, are really looking at kind of the infrastructure for those relationships. So what's kind of enabling those relationships to take place. So on networks, what we're really looking at, where are the kind of like interconnected relationships? They may not necessarily be place-based, but where are ways in which we're kind of communicating and sharing information and able to sort of learn things by virtue of these connections. So of course, when you hear networks, probably the first thing you think of is Facebook, but social networks, Facebook, Twitter, all of those are not the only game in town when it comes to networks. Historically, things like railroads, of course, are networks, like means of transportation and sort of providing economic trade. And in the future, what we're really looking at in terms of networks are things like dark nets and like dark patterns. So how can these sort of interconnected ways of inducing human behavior in a physical sense, like drone and bot swarms, same sort of thing. We kind of have arenas where maybe drone swarms are able to help with things like detecting farming and like kind of agriculture and being able to address particular issues. We've also seen examples of this being used in criminal networks as a means of defense. So like many ways that technology is being developed, it's not necessarily good or bad per se. It's really about how it's getting used. But nevertheless, networks are opportunities to be able to kind of decentralize power and exercise power in very decentralized ways, which is why you see blockchain technology and certainly open source technology development as ways of kind of decentralizing how things are exercised rather than from top down kind of being done everywhere and all the time. So one example of this are a company that's building PEEPs, the DAOs. And so if you're not familiar with DAOs, these are decentralized accountable organizations. This is all about how can you find ways of pooling resources and pooling information. And in PEEPs examples, what they're trying to do are allow people to kind of spin up organizations overnight to be able to support social causes that they really care about. So these are all kind of permissionless, completely digital organizations that are able to pool cryptocurrency and fund political and social causes that are important. And so you can see how these are ways in which networks can kind of, because they're permissionless, it allows them to kind of act in a somewhat semi-autonomous fashion, basically by people agreeing to participate. They sort of like outsourced the sort of behaviors that they like to take, and the sort of the DAOs can kind of like take over and sort of move forward. And you don't have to have the sort of active voting and sort of moving through a lot of what we see in our sort of more normal traditional organizational context. And so in that sense, becomes a lot more powerful for taking action, being able to move things forward in a way that doesn't require as much sort of people power, and therefore becomes a lot more powerful because it's not constrained by people's attention. And then next up, we have communities. So a lot of why I shared this graphic here of So Hot right now, if you've been around VCs at any point in time in the 2018, 2019, and 2020, communities really are so hot right now. You see them everywhere. They're being discussed as sort of the next big thing to propel startups to success. But what I want to share today is, the definition of communities that I'm working with. So groups of people connected by common place and or affinity, collaborating for collective action. I'm really thinking of communities less as, maybe just sort of a brand community for the purposes of selling your SaaS product, and really like how are people coming together, and in which ways when people come together are they able to exercise action. So of course, with a lot of communities on, sort of from a state side, we've seen a lot of kind of like data mining and surveillance of whether it's crowds, whether it's sort of communities itself in certain countries, certainly monitoring people for sort of political opposition. In the United States, especially, there's been a lot of ways in which algorithms have pervaded our public and social services. A lot in terms of sort of ease of use. This sort of is the working argument of it when you see things like smart cities. But certainly, there's a lot of ethical questions that come with monitoring the sort of broader public. And certainly on the social services front, there are a lot of documented harms that come from sort of algorithmic social services that come from sort of making the most vulnerable, sort of most subject to the biases that are found a lot in these particular ways, using these technologies in these ways as well. And then, of course, we've seen, I mentioned DAOs already, but we're also seeing the outgrowth of distributed cooperative organizations. So finding ways in which there can be a lot of sort of shared ownership and sort of shared stake in this, and bringing a lot of the sort of cooperative models that we've seen in maybe more traditional businesses, and bringing that to a digital space as well, and digital organization. So outside of communities kind of being used as the sort of next big thing, I think there's a lot of opportunity to not just sort of participate in community washing and kind of commodifying community, but rather sort of rethinking what it is that communities can do and what communities can be there for that can change our world, that supports greater belonging. So one example is this. So this is now a new housing complex, actually built on the old location of a church in Arlington, Virginia. And the reason why this came about is sort of a confluence of a couple of different, some of the forces that I mentioned before. One is a sort of this notion of de-churching, that of course, as religious membership has gone down, that a lot of churches in urban areas, especially those that are rapidly gentrifying, they're economically hard up. You know, they don't have the membership to provide the donations to be able to support the church. And even though they're non-taxable institutions, without the membership to be able to support them, the churches themselves are economically in dire straits. There's also this element of, both because of the gentrification that's making that problem worse, but it also represents an opportunity that because of gentrification, that there is a need for affordable housing. And so what you're seeing in this building is that the church decided to sell the property. Their former church was razed, and this affordable housing complex was built in its place, thereby fulfilling a social movement for the church to be able to support the larger community around it, and be a force for social good in the community that the church resides in. The church itself is still there. It exists in the ground floor of this building, of course, not as large as the space that maybe it occupied before, but nevertheless, that particular religious community has the space and opportunity to continue existing and serving the needs of the members that are still there, and hopefully of the members that are still to come. But I think that this becomes a powerful example for, taking what could be a crisis for both a smaller religious community as well as a larger community around it, and using this as a way for a win-win for both communities to be able to survive, and in many ways become mutually reliant on each other and strengthening both communities overall. And so that's really what we're seeing in this community space, is a shift to mutualism, that by looking to support each other, that all of us become stronger by virtue of that, by giving up a little, that all of us gain a lot more. And then these last two arenas are really looking at that outermost circle. So narratives and culture are really all about the enabling systems for all of this, for belonging. And so this is really, you can think of that last piece of the definition that I was talking about in terms of meaning and space making, sense making rather. And the narratives and culture are vehicles for uncovering that meaning, and being able to provide that sense making. So narratives, of course, are stories. Our secret weapon is storytelling, but it's a lot more than that. I think when people think about sort of narratives and stories, it's equated a lot with, children, a lot with sort of, this is just something being told to make you feel good. And while yes, stories can make us feel good, they also are not just about sort of making sense of the world. They're a way of finding meaning, and importantly, what I want to underline, they're a way of exercising power. So a lot of the growth of these sort of decentralized content platforms like Substack, like I publish my newsletter on Substack. There's a lot of other, certainly the alt-right has found their way of kind of decentralizing content platforms, and with Gab and Parler, we're going to see a lot more of this. Because it's important to have a platform to be able to tell stories, because it's, as we've seen over the last few years, that is a way of exercising power, and it's one to watch going forward. The other technology that I really want to highlight, and the reason why, is this notion of explainable AI. So of course, there's a lot of research around AI bias. Some folks think that a lot of that could be addressed simply if we were able to kind of unlock the black box of the algorithm of the AI and get a sense for understanding why a particular AI is making the decisions that it is, thereby making it explainable. I think that this could be particularly transformative from a narrative front, because I think one, whatever part of it is undermining this sort of perception of objectivity of artificial intelligence, that simply because something has come from an algorithm that it either must be true or correct. And so I think it works in service of undermining that sort of myth or assumption. The second thing is that providing sort of logic and reasoning from a particular artificial intelligence, it also provides a reflection back to us as humans, where we can better both understand how the AI is making decisions and sort of moving through reasoning, and also challenges us to be better at making decisions and explaining our reasoning as well. Part of the reason AI has particular bias issues is that we aren't always as clear or transparent or honest with ourselves as people in ways in which that really demonstrate why we are making the decisions that we are making. And then, of course, this third piece that, you know, we've seen a lot in the last few years, the kind of shadow banning and deplatforming, definitely practices in which a lot of social justice activists have been subject to a lot of this. And then, of course, now on the political stage, increasingly folks who are part of the alt-right have also been part of this as well. This is going to continue being a controversial practice about who has access to platforms to be able to tell certain stories about what is happening and why it's happening, and what should happen next. And therefore becomes a large source of power that right now is being held by technology companies, largely because they're the ones who control the platforms. But who knows what comes forward, especially as we are looking at more decentralized content platforms, what can happen. So one way I want to introduce this example is a social game platform called Hidden Door. And what I really love about this is that, you know, ostensibly it's about kids creating stories, but it's really about kids creating stories with AI and kids being able to engage in collaborative storytelling, and having it all be kind of combined in a way that can be creative, that is in gaming, which we know, of course, that kids engage with games like rather easily. Of course, adults do too. But it sort of provides a new way of understanding human machine collaboration in a forum that can be very creative and playful. And so I think it's just really amazing to think about, like, what are the narratives that can come from kids engaging with AI like this, from having the ability to kind of remix and re-envision these sort of stories, and kind of thinking about what does it look like if kids are basically able to like spin up fan fiction very easily by virtue of gameplay. So I think Hidden Door is a really interesting example of like what could come of narratives, not just being about sort of from power, from someone from a position of power, and sort of sharing a particular story, but being very decentralized, and also being in the arena of kind of play and curiosity as well. And last but not least, we have culture. So this meme is really kind of making a joke of, you know, if I make a meme, is this culture? But what I want to underline is, you know, much like narrative kind of maybe gets a little bit of short shrift, I think that talking about culture also does as well. Culture is really about values. It's about the sort of ethos that are all about it's kind of both the reasons and the ways that we are propelling the behaviors that we see, and really defining the norms that are shaping belonging. And so a lot of the technologies that I think that are particularly interesting as it relates to culture, and the power that comes from defining culture and creating culture, is one around kind of digital archiving. We all kind of maybe anecdotally understand how our history kind of determines like how we understand our present, like that provides additional sort of context. And again, that sort of shows, you know, values. A lot of times you might say like, well, that's how they thought back then, but that's not how we think now. And so we need sort of history, and therefore kind of archiving and preservation to be able to understand and be able to make those inferences, and sort of show how values might change over time and how the behaviors need to change over time as well. Related to this, of course, again, going back to blockchain technology, but it's the notion of having immutable content and having immutable records. So having something that doesn't go away, that always exists digitally, is certainly going to change the way that we understand culture going forward and how we can define culture going forward. A lot of the sort of media battles over things like cancel culture, cultural appropriation, take on a whole new sort of valence if you're really thinking about, well, can we actually prove who created this first? Can we actually prove who this belonged to first? And at least undermines a lot of the sort of, well, it's not a big deal because it's just out there. And it's like, well, now we can prove sort of provenance and to some extent ownership, depending on what the kind of content under debate is. And then the last technology I'm looking at that's kind of reshaping culture and reshaping belonging is this notion of VR as an empathy machine. It's something that gets talked about a lot, that by going into a virtual reality experience and you can kind of see a world or a life that's very different of your own, that necessarily makes you sort of more open to kind of understanding where this person might be coming from, and therefore makes you more sympathetic. What we are seeing and what we can even kind of see from some of our real world analogs of this is that this isn't necessarily true, that we can't just sort of automate the generation of empathy, that there has to be a certain element of motivation there and preparation. And that to a certain extent, by going in with that expectation that if people just merely experience the lives of someone else who they either maybe disagree with or are not familiar with, that actually could be incurring backlash. And so it's just something to be aware of if we're thinking about shifting culture, that this isn't going to be something that is simply done by dropping everyone into a VR machine and then we're all going to get along afterwards. A lot of culture change is human work, and it's going to continue being human work in the future. But of course, technology can both help enable a lot of that to happen, but it also could be an impediment as well. And so when thinking about culture and culture change and changes in belonging, this is an example I want to show that's not necessarily technologically driven. This is called Project Truth, Reconciliations and Reparations. And it's an initiative headed by Black women and gender nonconforming people who are all coming together basically to build a grassroots movement really to focus on addressing the foundational inequalities and harms that the United States was built upon, and having the opportunity to come together and recognizing those harms and deciding how to build a better reconciled future where everyone can be included. And so it's this sort of collective movement that's happening. It's again, like I said before, like being able to look back and see where values have come from and knowing that, we didn't get to where we are today as a country by not having this culture of slavery and treating people who are less than subhuman, and continuing to do that over a very long period of time and refusing both to recognize that and to rectify that as well. And so this particular project is really looking at how can we change American culture through movement building, movement building that yes will include narratives, but also movement building that will sort of question the norms that we have today, what we accept to be true, what values that we uphold, how are we incentivizing particular behaviors, and really trying to embark on a collective both decision-making process and a collective imagination process as well, which I think is the really important part, collective imagination. And so related to that, this quote is from my journal that was sort of mid-pandemic, and thinking about, we don't just have to imagine a better world, we can create and immerse ourselves in a better world. And so what I want to leave you with today is that, yes, a lot of my work is about futures thinking. And I think a lot of people get caught up in the sort of the thinking and the imagination and the sort of ideas of it. But what I want to leave you with today and encourage you is that startups are just powerful engines, yes, for economic growth, but they're also powerful engines for changing communities, for changing our markets, for changing human behavior. And I really hope that this leaves you with some ways of thinking in which you can build your startup or leverage your startup in such a way that it's actually making the world a better place, and creating that better place for all of us to be in. And ultimately, don't just stay in thinking, but really move to doing and taking action. So with that, I want to thank you for watching this presentation today. Here's all the information to find and follow me, and looking forward to meeting all of you in the future.